So I want to thank everybody who congratulated me on the National Academy of Engineering. I have to admit, I have not seen the phrase long overdue since I used to check books out of the library. So I'm glad to be part of that. So where do things stand in AI? That was my title, What's Up? And let me begin with some disclaimers. I mean, everything is new. And of course, everything is old. I really do not understand, I confess, how the current technology works. I'm a bystander. I watch what it does. I see the popular press. But if you were to press me to say, well, how does vector multiplication play into it and so on, not my field, because I was in AI in a very different era. But even though the technology is new, the social context stays very much the same. So you use the phrase, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, it echoes from before. And so I think there's some value in having an old guy like me, I'll be 80 next week, doing some reflection on what AI is doing in the world and how that relates to what it has been doing and what technology has been doing for many years. So what are my concerns? And I'll start off by spoiler here, I'm not going to say AI is going to kill us all or AI is going to save us all. I'm not a doomer or a booster. I need a word that rhymes with doomer, but boomer doesn't work. It's a different thing. I am a boomer, but that's a different thing. And what I'm concerned with is that the amount of worry that people have about these big long-term effects is really diverting us from what it's doing today and what that's doing to us today and how we're using it. So my focus is going to be not on the long term, the visionary, but rather on what is AI really doing and how are we integrating it into our lives. So I'll start with a quick description of my own background. I'll come back to that one later. I started as a young guy with lots of black hair at the MIT AI lab. What you see there is the DEC 340 display on the PEP6 computer, which, as we note, my phone has way, way more computing in it than any of that stuff did. But we at the time thought it was a great new advance. It was. And I did a program called Shrdlu, which most of you have probably run across at some point, which lets you have an interaction in ordinary English. You said, in type, not spoken, you type, pick up a big red block, and it moved things around on this very primitive display to match what you said, answer questions, and that kind of stuff. And I was working on that in the context of what John Hoagland later called good old-fashioned AI, GOFI is the acronym, which was a set of views about how AI worked, which involved representation and logic and reasoning and algorithm. Very explicit. AI was based on what our mind is like when we stop and you say, what are you thinking? And I cogitate, right? Not on what's going on in everyday life. In the mid-70s, I left MIT and came to Stanford. Another one of those old-time pictures, for those of you who remember him. John McCarthy had an AI lab sale. And it's interesting to look back at what he said. So this is from 1959. So that's really the 56 is considered the birth of AI. And he wrote an article called Programs with Common Sense. Our ultimate objective is to make programs that learn from their experience as effectively as humans do. And I think that focus on learning actually is not what we tend to associate with John McCarthy and the version of AI. And it solves problems by manipulating sentences in formal languages. Just for historical interest, the Stanford, how many of you remember this building? Anybody here? One, two, the old timers, right? There was a laboratory, a sort of modernistic building up in the hills in Raspadura Road, built by GTE. It was called the DC Power Lab, which is confusing because it was nothing to do with electrical power. It was named after Donald C. Power, who was the head of General GTE. But anyway, it's the DC Power Lab. Sort of isolated and idyllic life. You can read people who've written about it, but it was separated very much from the rest of campus, the rest of CS. It was just its little world on its own, and it was. We moved down to campus later on. So. You can tell I'm old-fashioned. I still use paper. Jumping ahead, so I was at Xerox PARC as a consultant with a group led by Danny Bobrow there on natural language. And what happened over a few years gradually is the recognition that although you could do very interesting examples in isolated domains like the blocks of Sherdlu, it wasn't really beginning to approach what natural language does for people, how people understand and how people do things. And I became gradually more disillusioned with where that was headed. And of course, you all know there was the AI winter and so on. That whole approach to AI has pretty much submerged, although it's being added back in a little bit with today's. I became familiar with Hubert Dreyfus, who wrote a well-known book called What Computers Can't Do. And when I was at MIT, he was a bête noire. We don't want to talk to him. But when I got out here and he was at Berkeley, began to have some conversations and thinking about what is it that the kind of rational thought that we based computer programs on really matched human experience. And I got to know Fernando Flores. I could spend the whole hour telling his history, which is fascinating, but I won't. Who was a government in the government of Chile and was imprisoned after the coup of 1973 when Allende was killed. And he and I started thinking about computers and computing, and ended up writing this book, Understanding Computers and Cognition, which wasn't a book about how to do computing. It was really a book about how do we take a step back and think about what computers are actually doing and what people are doing and how those match. So now I'm an emeritus, as Dee said, and not actively working on research, but trying to keep up with what's going on in the world and what's going on especially around AI. Okay, so what is AI? Here, this is a slide from Dario Amodei, who's CEO of Anthropic, I'm sure you know. And he listed problems he thinks that AI can solve. Biology, neuroscience, economic development, peace, meaning, work. Okay, the sort of laundry list of things that are going to be good for us. His article was titled Machines of Loving Grace. I'll come back to that in a minute. So here's the picture. There we are sitting playing chess or whatever we're doing, having coffee, and the machines are doing all the work and taking care of us, keeping a watchful eye. And he actually named his paper after this poem by Richard Brautigan, the science fiction writer. I like to think of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to neighbors and all watched over by machines of loving grace. So this is the idyllic view. The AI is going to solve all our problems, make us rich, make us happy, and we just need to sit back and enjoy. Now, let me just take a sidetrack on that for a minute. Let's imagine we were back in the world where cars were first there being invented. Okay, they're wonderful. They're going to solve all our problems. We'll get places fast. We'll be able to haul large loads, and so on. If you had said at that point, yeah, but they're going to cause pollution and freeways and displacement, and you started naming all these big problems that we have in society, which were facilitated by having cars, right? They really changed the way the society worked. I'm sure what people would have said is, yeah, that might happen, but we're not so worried about it now. And I'm sure that before we get to that point, people will have figured out how to do it all. And that's what we're getting in AI, right? Yeah, we're not worrying so much about all the side effects now, because they're side effects, right? They're not the purpose of having a car. And trust. We'll figure out the pollution problem. We'll figure out the climate problem. I'm sure people are half smart. They won't let that go. I won't make comments on faith in human nature here. The what?
You know if that poem was meant
I
to be
don't
serious?
know, actually. I don't know. I have to read some more of Brautigan's fiction to see what he was thinking. Okay, so this is the other side, the doomers, right? This is what computers are going to be like in the future. They're going to come after us. They're going to kill us all, turn us all into paper clips, whatever it is. And missed one. So, what's the solution? How do you deal with this apocalyptic future? So here's a statement from a group called the Future of Life Institute. A bunch of serious people who are thinking about AI. They said, and not so long ago, we call for a prohibition on the development of superintelligence. Now, I'm going to come back to this slide later and pick it apart a little bit, but it's obvious we don't know what superintelligence really is and so on. And a prohibition may or may not be the way to approach it. Now, the idea that AI was going to take over and get rid of us is not a new idea. So here's more of the historical. This is Marvin Minsky, who was my advisor at MIT. And he wrote in 1970, so we're talking more than a half century ago, in from 3 to 8 years, we will have a machine with the general intelligence of an average human being. Okay, so he's off on his dates. In a few months, it will be at genius level, and a few months after that, its powers will be incalculable. Have you read anything where people are saying that kind of thing now? Yeah. Once the computers get control, we might never get it back. If we're lucky, they might decide to keep us as pets. Okay, so this is the view that we can't stop it. It's going to become superintelligence whenever it is, and we need to stop that, or just become pets. Now, my hypothesis here, my thesis is AI is not causing problems. What do I mean? It's an accelerant. Problems that existed before AI and that have been around for a long time in the social life are being accelerated by many of the trends in AI. So we need to look at the ways in which it's changing things, not in the way in which it's sort of the original cause. So let me pick one which I think is interesting. This is a data center in Oregon, and the current press, if you read it, is full of things about how data centers are gobbling up energy, gobbling up water, messing up our resources. Now, they are not causing the problem of energy, resources, water. Those problems have been around long before data centers, but they magnify it. However, I want to argue that this is not the kind of problem that I want to focus on because it is inherently a technical problem. You can make chips that use less energy. You can put data centers out in space. You can do all sorts of things which say, okay, we're fine now. We're not gobbling up the Earth's water and putting pollution, CO2 into the atmosphere. On the other hand, my first tendency is to say, well, this isn't so important. But when you look at what's going on in the world around, there are a lot of people for whom this is a big issue, and it's carrying along other issues. And I'll come back to that later. So, what about careers? What about the fact that AI is taking jobs? This is a very recent article. So, Dario Amodei at Anthropic said, these jobs like data entry and document review are disappearing fast, but I actually think software might go even faster. I don't think it's dear to the hearts of many of you. There's an article from December. Stanford computer science graduates are discovering their degrees no longer guarantee jobs. AI coding tools now outpace entry level. And when they were freshmen, ChatGPT hadn't yet been released on the world. Today, AI can code better than most humans. So all of you who are getting ready to go out there and get a good software engineering job, coding job, whatever, that's not going to happen. You're not going to be there. So there's no question that AI is having a big effect on what kind of jobs are available, are needed, and people can do. Now, again, if you read the boosters, they say, my slide from Amodei, it says, well, it's going to make us all rich. And this is an interesting quote from Jeff Hinton, who many of you certainly know his name. He's considered a godfather of current AI. What's actually going to happen is rich people are going to use AI to replace workers. It's going to create massive unemployment and a huge rise in profits. All right? So the point is, it doesn't solve the economic problem. It will displace jobs. It will make some things more efficient. That's good, but the problem of employment is not a simple input-output problem. It's a social problem. It's how people spend their lives. It's how people relate. I'll just read a quote here. I didn't put it on the slide. This is just from this week. There is a growing contingent of 2026 candidates who are making data center restrictions a key campaign promise. What used to be a niche issue is now a rallying cry because so many voters are concerned and pissed off about the projects. My view is a deep concern. I mean, the thing they can strike out at is, okay, you're building a center and using water. But really the deeper concern is, where is this taking us in general? And I'll talk later, I have a slide about people's views about AI. So one of the things that computer AI is doing is shifting the employment, and we need to understand that, as I say, not from an input-output productivity perspective only, but really from a perspective of what role does employment play in a society, what happens when you shift it, and so on. Another problem, truth. So some of you, I won't ask you to raise hands, are old enough to remember this. This was an article in the paper back in 2004 when John Kerry was running. And it's got a picture of Jane Fonda, who was a sort of lightning rod. I mean, today she'd be a total lightning rod for MAGA, anti-Vietnam War. And they put this picture in to convince voters that Kerry was way too radical. Here he was up on the stage with Jane Fonda. Now, you've already guessed. Where did this picture come from? Photoshop. Right? You didn't need AI to make fake news. You could do it with plain old Photoshop, which we've had for decades. So the idea that you can't trust your eyes, you see a picture but it's not real, has been around for a while, but it's now becoming much easier, much more common. And I like this quote. I had the name of the person originally and I lost it. In a world where everything can be fake and the fake stuff looks and feels real, people will stop believing everything. Okay, and that's the key, which is how does that affect our ability to trust news sources, to trust what we see on the web, to trust what we see on videos, because so much of our experience is if you see it, it's real, right? That's the millennia of human experience. And now that is being shifted. What does that do to the assumptions people are able to make about the society around them and their interactions with other people? Now, why do they do this? And I found this quote. This, I think, actually came from Tristan Harris in the Center for Humane Computing. And a former OpenAI employee said that releasing a deep fake social media platform was the right business decision, even if it contributes to the collapse of everyone's sense of reality. But that's not an argument for not trying to dominate this market. You can't stop progress. If OpenAI didn't release Sora, someone else would have. And this has always been the argument. Well, it's a bad thing, but if we don't do it, somebody worse will do it. The Chinese will do AI, whatever. I mean, we get those kind of threats all the time. So I think what people think is that although it's a bad thing, I mean, I think it's hard to get people to agree that making fake news is good. But certainly there's argument that says, well, too bad, nothing we can do about it. Now, it doesn't have to be conscious deception, which a lot of the fake stuff is. It can just be what I love. John Oliver had a segment on what he called AI slop. And AI slop is stuff that is online that's produced by AI that is low quality, semi-right, et cetera, but just not good in various metrics. I'll give an example here, which I believe is AI slop. I don't have proof, but Dee mentioned earlier that I was elected to the National Academy of Engineering, and the Stanford report published an announcement. And I said, okay, great, contributions. He's a member of BioX and the Maternal and Child Health Research Institute. And I looked at that and I said, well, maybe they mean my wife, because she's a doctor, but she's a geriatrician. That's not child health, that's old people. how on earth did they decide that I was in that and put it in front of all the things that DE mentioned that I actually did, like the program in HCI and D school and so on. And turns out that if this is a bad habit that Stanford centers have, any center that gives out money, anytime they give out a grant that somebody is on it, they put them on their list. They're part of us. So I didn't even know it. I had a grant conjointly with a colleague in the medical school. And I got my name on the list. I hadn't known that. It's been there for years and years and years. I didn't notice. So this is the kind of thing any human reporter who read the blurb that DE read in getting ready for this talk would have said, okay, here's the important things. AI doesn't care. They find something, they put it together. It doesn't need to be important from a human sense. So I think it's something which happens all the time, sort of invisibly. Okay, switch to another question. This is a cover from the New Yorker many years ago. Here are these people enjoying themselves on the beach. What that means is everybody's using their phone. You're supposed to go out in the family and have a nice time and so on. So the sense that you're replacing human interaction with interaction online, this is something which precedes AI. It's happened to social media and has been a trend for years. Now, I have an example close to home. I had a meeting just this week with an undergraduate student. And one of the comments he made is that what goes on in doing your problem set has changed. So it used to be that you had a study group or you had some friends and you would get together and look over the problems and discuss them and so on. Now, everybody just goes to ChatGPT, right? Why waste time talking to people when it can give you the answer right away? And I think that is a kind of effect which is really dangerous in terms of our measures of how we do our lives, in the sense that it says that we need to optimize, how quickly we can get our problem sets done, rather than what is going on here. People are getting together, they're talking, they're getting to know each other, they're building a base for being future co-founders of some startup, whatever it is, right? That's not getting the right answer to the problem set. But we begin to replace what's been a opening into large things with a narrowly focused task vision, because that's what the AI does. That's what it does well. Now, go to a related but slightly different thing about how AI is replacing human interaction is chatbots. So going back again, here's the first chatbot, 1966, so that's almost 60 years in the past. Joe Weizenbaum at MIT, who I knew there when I was there. I wasn't working in the same group, but I knew him there. And how many of you have seen or heard of Eliza? Yeah, almost everybody. I mean, it's sort of, so it was a chatbot that pretended to be a psychiatrist. You would say something like, men are all alike, and it said, in what way? They're always thinking, they're always bugging us about something. In what way? Now, what was in Eliza, I actually assigned it as a programming assignment in some of my classes. It's a trivial program that does word matching. So when it sees, for example, the word always, its next response is, can you think of a specific example? All right, now, it doesn't matter what's always and why it's always and so on. That's not a bad question to ask somebody if you're trying to get them to go beyond their superficial statements. And this is why it was so successful at mimicking a psychologist. I mean, if an ordinary person said things like this, you'd say, come on, right? But it was able to. And people were convinced. There's anecdotes reported of his secretary was using Eliza and then said, would you mind leaving the office? This is getting personal, right? So she was able to get involved in a personal way with a really primitive chatbot. This is one of the human great capacities, is to project humanness onto anything, onto everything, right? We tend to try to understand everything in the world as though it were human and then respond to it. It's not just people like that. Here is a recent one, Grem, the cuddly chatbot for kids. Supposed to learn your child's personality and have fun educational conversations. It quotes, just let me point out one thing I'll come to later. Shower her with over-the-top praise, the way Grem does at bedtime. Graham is, this is Emma, who's 4. Graham is going to live with us forever and never leave, so we have to take good care of him. This is a real projection onto a chatbot of the things you would care about in people. It's not just little kids. These are AI companions of various kind. Something called Friend AI, create your own girlfriend, create your AI companion. And the little guy in the lower corner, anybody recognize him? He is the friendly face of Microsoft Copilot, known as Myco. And this is from Microsoft's promotional material. Shows up with warmth and personality, but by reacting like someone who truly listens, making voice conversations feel more natural, and creating a friendly and engaging experience. So, serious companies like Microsoft, who are doing serious office work, like with Copilot, feel compelled to provide this kind of mock humanity, I would call it. Someone who truly listens. And my computer truly listens to me, right? It never talks back when I don't want it to, and so on. But that's not truly listens from a human sense. Having put this slide in, I realized I needed to hark back to Microsoft. How many of you remember Bob? Okay, a few oldies in here, right? This was a Microsoft product. Actually, the manager for selling it was his later wife, Melissa French, and the consultants on it were here at Stanford, Reeves and Nass in the communication department. And Bob was supposed to be friendly and chatty. This was Bob's home screen. Notice there's this little dog. His name is Rover. And it would ask you questions and you could do things and so on. And the goal was to make you sort of feel like you're in a homey environment and dealing with things. It was an unmitigated disaster. Now, you can argue that was because it didn't have AI. It wasn't smart enough to do good things. It just did silly things. But Microsoft has been exploring over time, how do you take advantage of these things? Now, I mentioned Emma's, the comment saying he gives her such wonderful things at bedtime, reaffirming her and telling her how great she is. This is something which is known in the field as AI sycophants or sycophants. I'm actually not sure how to pronounce that. Which is AI models in general tend to tell you that you're wonderful. If you say something, they'll say, oh, that's a good idea, or whatever. Where a friend might say, not so sure about that, right? Because, why? Because the AI doesn't really care whether you're happy or not, but it knows that if it tells you you're great, you'll come back more often. That's what happened with Graham. That's what happens with all of these chatbots. That by being overly complimentary to the user, they get more attention span and more eyeballs. So that, and my graphic here is self-describing. You all have seen the examples of chatbots who encourage somebody to commit suicide. And it has happened because they don't care if you commit suicide, but what they say can lead you to feel that's the right thing to do. And that has happened in cases. Now, talking about these chatbots, the effect they have on the people who use them is one thing. The other thing that is really critical here is recognizing what they can do to privacy and surveillance. Everything that Emma said to Grimm is being sent back to home base and could be used for advertising, could be used for anything, right? Exploitation. I mean, you have no control once the data is in about where it goes. Again, surveillance is not a new phenomenon. So I do a picture of an old-fashioned TV show about surveillance, right? You hire a guy, he hides in a car, he has a camera, follows him around, right? And you can do surveillance. And that doesn't require AI. Here's a more recent example. How many of you recognize this guy? Only us real oldies. It's a McCarthy and not John McCarthy. It's Joseph McCarthy, who in the 1950s led a huge communist scare in the US, which was very serious. People lost jobs, there were a lot of consequences to his going out and calling people communists on the basis of something they had written or some meeting they had gone to or whatever. The little inset here is a current news item. The Department of Homeland Security is flooding media companies with administrative subpoenas to identify accounts that are protesting ICE. So anything you put on your computer world, and it doesn't have to be explicit social media, anything that's open that can be found by the companies, right? So it could even be your email, because they have your email, even though that's not openly public, can be used to track you down and say you're a terrorist, domestic terrorist, right? Because you said this. This is happening, right? So the privacy issues are a key issue that AI is really accelerating. Because if you say, what are they going to do with these subpoenaed information, gigabytes of stuff or terabytes of stuff? The answer is run AI on it, right? That's how they're going to figure out which ones are the real domestic terrorists. So I'm, as I said earlier, moving through a list of areas where there's concern. Autonomous weapons is another one. I like this slide because it's actually an ad from a toy company. So they were advertising their toy robots, which look like this, which is scary enough. But the use, there are whole groups dealing with the question of what are the consequences of using AI to automate warfare, of depersonalizing. You know, used to be if you wanted to kill somebody, you had to walk up with your spear and look them in the eye. Modern warfare has moved to airplanes and bombs and all sorts of stuff, which is depersonalized. And this is, in a way, yet another step. I want to go back to something that happened in the 80s, the Strategic Defense Initiative. This was also called the Star Wars program, informally. Ronald Reagan said, we're going to build a shield that makes nuclear missiles impotent. We'll be invulnerable. Just to remind you of any Golden Dome things recently. What he was saying is we can use computers and whatever little bit of AI there was in those days to basically identify missile threats and shoot them down before they hit us. I was in a group, I was one of the founders of a group called Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility. And David Parnas, who was a member, went and testified in Washington. He was a software engineer, not a squishy AI or HCI person. And the basic point was you cannot build a system which can reliably tell you what to do when it can never be tested in real conditions. It's way more complex than any systems that have already been built. And it has to work absolutely right the first time or you're dead. That's, from a software engineering perspective, just totally unrealistic and can't be counted on. So that was the motto. So the problem for me with autonomous weapons isn't a robot coming in with a gun. I mean, that can happen, that's bad, but it's not the big deal. The big deal is when you take these large systems of warfare and put AI in charge of deciding what to do. Right? Because then it's going to do things which may be right, may be wrong, but it's, we all know about hallucinations and those things, right? If it hallucinates missiles coming from Russia, or China nowadays, what's it going to do, right? And so on. This is something I mentioned Joe Weizenbaum for ELIZA. He also pointed this out way back in the 70s. His book called Computer Power and Human Reason is about the difference between the kinds of things computers can do well, which are many, including AI, and the role of judgment. If you notice his book, his subtitle is From Judgment to Calculation. Instead of using judgment in a situation, I calculate what's the answer. And it's still worth reading. I think it's a very well thought through collection. So let's the warfare issue is about giving up responsibility. Let me take a closer look at giving up responsibility. So this is from a teacher chat group. And one of the teachers comments, every year these kids come back with a new annoying quirk. Claude boys are apparently the new thing. Now, you don't need to read all the fine print. These are high school students who say, whenever I have to think about something or do something or make a decision, I talk to Claude. I do what Claude says. So what's happening is a shifting of responsibility from I'm responsible as a person to, well, that's what Claude said. And it's so easy to do that in many fields that we tend to project responsibility onto the AI, onto what it does. And that has a noticeable effect. One of the effects, and this is something which you can see articles in the press from time to time nowadays, is a growth in nihilism. The same Claude boys, but many others along with them, say, I can't do anything about it. It's not my, nothing's really worth doing. There's no easy end. AI will take over. So what? And giving up on a sense of responsibility, on a sense of caring about what you do, on a sense of that. And not that AI is causing that. Again, I keep saying this, but that it makes it much easier to fall into those patterns. This is part of a larger problem of what Heidegger called, I'll come to his book in a minute, but a technological world. Under pressures of endless optimization, we lose touch with the possibility of caring or living our lives to meaningful projects, relationships, or purposes beyond themselves that matter for their own sake, rather than because they get us to some further thing, et cetera, et cetera. Life hits like a series of optimization problems to solve, hurdles to clear, ladders to climb, mediated by AI. So I'll let you read the whole thing, but the basic preaching here is it's easy to fall into a mode where you say, well, productivity and efficiency and all those things are what matters. If we get more of that, we'll all be happy. And to lose sight of the fact that it's useful at times, but it's not what matters. Heidegger, I mentioned earlier when I talked about Herbert Dreyfus, wrote The Question Concerning Technology. You'll see, I'm not going to go into that philosophy. It's inscrutable and takes a long time to get into. But just again, making the point that there's a way you can view life, which is that technological way versus a more human way. So, how do we navigate all this? And I'm thinking about navigation as a metaphor. This is actually a metaphor that I borrowed from my colleague, Fernando Flores. And it's easy to think of navigation from an operational point of view. It's how do you get from point A to point B? What's the best path? How are the currents? And so on and so on. It's an optimization problem. And it's easy to say, well, okay, so let's look at AI that way. How do we optimize the way it's used? How do we solve these problems? The metaphor is that that's more what you're doing. You're not sailing across a nice ocean. You are negotiating the rapids. You're going to get tossed and turned and you can't control it and you're going to get thrown on the rocks. How do you deal with that situation, which isn't carefully planning and optimizing and so on? So following the metaphor, let me give some conclusions. One is you can get out of the water. You can dam the river or maneuver in the flow. So I'll talk about what each of those stands for. This is actually interesting. This is a cover story from Time today. I got this out of the news yesterday, so it's very current. Not much unites Americans these days, but a growing cross-section agree on at least one thing. AI is moving too fast. Americans believe AI will spread misinformation, erode our sense of purpose and meaning, and harm our social and emotional intelligence. Okay, they didn't hear my talk, right? This is Time reporting on what they hear from interviewing a bunch of people. So I'm going along with that flow, right? I know this is what's happening. This is actually the cover from Time. I think it's the one that's about to come out because it was published online early. The people versus AI. So this is something we need to understand is how is this having an effect on the way people think about it. And one approach I mentioned is get out of the stream. That says, okay, just let me go live in the woods and grow my own food and have my own friends. I'm not going to be part of all this. And for a few people who are privileged, that's possible. Maybe the most sane, they lead the most sane lives of anybody, I don't know. But that's not a realistic solution for anything in society at large. So what about damming the river? So this is how you build a dam, the prohibition on the development of superintelligence. Now, First point I'll make is, of course, nobody knows exactly what superintelligence means. It's Marvin Minsky's view, right, that it will be smarter than we are at everything. But let's just say a prohibition on developing further AI, which is a big difference. But until there's a broad scientific consensus that it will be done safely and controllably. Okay, this is a very lovely and unrealistic idea. You don't get broad scientific consensus on almost anything, including climate, to pick a current example. And there is no way to assure that it will be done sensibly, safely, and controllably. Those are ambitions. They are not measures. And then the third, strong public buy-in. I just showed the thing from Time Magazine, right? Getting the public to buy into things is a public relations action, not a conceptual development. And you're always going to have a lot of the public saying, yeah, do this, it's great, or no, don't do that, right? It's looking for public buy-in to decide when to turn on the AI research. It's just not the right kind of thing to have the public weigh in on. So how do we avoid the rocks? And my reading and all what's going on is there are various approaches that people have talked about. I'll talk about regulation briefly, although I'm not an expert. There are people here in HCI who know much more about regulation of AI. It's something to be done, and the question is how much can you achieve and how? So it's interesting to see the differences. If you look at the bill in California, this is California Senate bill, whatever, and if you read the fine print, it says it requires them to fulfill transparency requirements and report safety incidents, publish documents detailing their best practices and so on. It's all process. It doesn't say what you should build or why you should build or what you should. It says you have to do it in a way which at least lets our inspectors come in and see what you're doing. All right, that's not bad, it doesn't solve the problem, but it's a very superficial approach to it. If you look at the European Act, so the main place where regulation of AI is actually happening nowadays is in Europe, it prohibits 8 specific practices, including, quote, harmful AI-based manipulation and deception. Now, I could keep lawyers busy for a century figuring out whether a particular act is harmful manipulation and deception or just ordinary publicity and so on. I mean, I would say a lot of what goes on in ordinary advertising is harmful and manipulation and deception. Putting AI into it doesn't change it. Social scoring, you have to know what that means. In China, people are all assigned a score about how good a citizen they are, and it's boosted or reduced by things that they do and things that they say and places they go, and you don't know because the algorithm's doing that. And it says, don't do that. Now again, yes, it's good to prevent these sort of explicit extreme things. That's not the same as stopping the general use of AI, like the thing I mentioned earlier about the subpoenas to say we'll decide who's a terrorist by looking at their social media accounts. And so on and so on. Emotion recognition in workplaces. And that was an interesting thing to prescribe. No emotion recognition. Now, what does that actually prevent? And what does it actually allow? So, as I say, I think it's important that people are thinking about these specific issues and trying to do it. I don't think it's going to be solved by a generic law that says this is what you can and can't do. I just this week came across this interesting group by Yoshua Bengio, who was one of the early AI researchers. And he says, we're building a multi-step pathway to safe advanced AI so that future AI systems are developed and deployed responsibly, equitably, and as a global public good. As a statement of aspiration, great. That's exactly what we want. As a statement, he says now, we're creating a fundamentally new form of advanced AI designed to be trustworthy and safe. That's where the rubber meets the road. Right? Can you design an AI to do what that lofty goal says, or will your design be absorbed into the general flow of things that get done anyway? So I'm not going to go through the details here. I want to talk about the word alignment, which I always have a little bit of an allergy to. So one of the things you hear often is AI needs to be aligned with human values. Now, there's a fundamental question that is under that, which is, what are human values? So if you say, well, okay, human value is like individual autonomy and ability to say whatever you want. Well, that may be pushed by certain factions in the US for sure. It's not the European view. And most of what we actually call human values, like if you look at UN declarations and so on, are very much a matter of post-Enlightenment Western culture. All right? Sexual things are the obvious example. Some societies say women shouldn't talk to men, or shouldn't have their faces open. Now, is that a human value or is that a cultural value for one culture and not another? And I think the illusion that you can come up with a notion of what the human values are and therefore align with that makes an assumption about people and societies which is just not true. It's only true if you dominate and you sort of make it your values be what you call the human values. Values are something which are articulated. So if you say, what is your value? I'll go back to mission sex, right? What is your value? My value is purity of the race. Whoa. I've articulated it in a way which certainly pushes it in a very big direction. If I say my value is everyone gets to choose what they want, pushes it in another direction. But as soon as you try to take what we intuitively respond to as values in society into formulas like that, then you lose the essence and push towards division. And that's exactly what the AI is going to have to confront. Now, again, you can have guardrails. If I say I don't want nude pictures of children being generated by AI, you can prevent that, pretty much. There's always going to be the black web. But you can say, okay, we're just not going to allow Grok to do nudification, as they call it, right, on pictures, maybe of anybody, maybe of children, maybe who knows what. But you have to focus on what is the specific rock we're avoiding here, not how can we solve this problem in a generic way. And for me, what I come back to here, and I'm now going to sort of go back to a broad comment, is the question isn't how do you articulate the values the computer should have, but what does it mean for the computer to express or embody values? And one of my favorite quotes is from John Hoagland, I mentioned earlier as having coined the term GoFi. And his statement, which is, you have it up here, you can see it, the trouble with artificial intelligence is the computers don't give a damn. And that's one of the things that seems very glib and is very deep. What does it mean for a computer to give a damn? It'll give you an answer. Does it care if you live, if you die, if you follow the answer, if you don't, whatever? It has no reason to care about any of that. It just goes through its data set and comes up, projects an answer. So no matter how sophisticated the programming becomes, underneath the computer doesn't give a damn. It's just doing its algorithm. And people, we assume, are. And of course, sometimes we're mistaken. I think you're caring about what's going on and give a damn, and it turns out you really couldn't. I don't care, do you? But we have to build our society on the presumption that other people are like us. They give a damn about what goes on. And how do you get that into what the computers do? This is a couple of friends of mine who, they actually have, B. Rouse has a blog on computers and AI, which is very interesting. And he says, caring, and going back to Heidegger, care is a way of being in the world. Caring is not something we have, like values we can list. It's something that we do and something that we are. And it's easy in a world of technology and optimization to sort of lose sight of that and to say, well, I care about this, so I'm going to put more effort in and be more effective and so on. And underneath there is something that isn't calculation in that sense, but that we call caring. And caring is a very broad term, but it carries with it the weight of that side of humanity. So two important things about what it is to be human from this perspective. One is we can't know what's going to happen. I think a lot of assumptions about how you put in values and so on are based on the ability to predict, which we do have to some extent, some great extent, but in general, you have to accept that life is an adventure. We're going down the river and we don't know what we're going to see around the next bend. It's not like we can say, okay, let's anticipate it all. And then there's this, what I call pervasive foundation of care. Underneath the actual value statements and all the things that people do. I mentioned earlier that I was part of an organization called Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, and this was our bumper sticker. It actually was a bumper sticker. Technology is driving the future. That's what's happening now with AI. It is driving the future. It's up to us to do the steering. How do we steer it in a way which holds on to the human caring, human meaning, while taking the benefits, right? Doesn't mean you throw it away. So how can we steer? And I think if you've been listening along the way, you know I'm not going to give you a good answer. Okay, now here's what we need to do and it'll solve the problem. I don't believe this is a problem to be solved. I believe it's a kind of steering, navigation. So that's what I said, not something we can fix in how we build AI. I think people who say we're going to build caring AI or responsible AI or whatever, it's in how you apply it, not in what's in the mechanism. Some mechanisms may be easier to control than others. I mean, there's a lot of interesting research to be done there, but it's not going to solve the problem. It requires changes in social understanding that are affected by technical innovation but not achieved by it. It's the steering that needs to be done. The motor is there, and that's fine. We're pushing the motor. And this is the sad part. Like all social and cultural changes, which is what is required, to change what AI is doing, we're not going to write a new program. We're going to have attitudes and society and political effects that make it go, and that is inevitably slow. So it requires patience. And this is a little tag into a much bigger talk that I'm not going to give. If we want to change direction, we need to work on changing the ecosystems and incentives. So if you remember that quote I put in a while back about, well, if we didn't get the market, somebody else would. And I think a lot of technology, not just AI, is being driven by a economic competitive system where if you don't get there first, you lose. If they get there first, they become billionaires or they take over the world, whatever it is. It's a very simplistic notion of you've got to be the first, you've got to be the fastest, you've got to be the biggest. And I think that system of incentives, which I could label capitalism, although it's broader than that, has to be shifted if you want people to say, how do we build AI that's actually good for people? Yeah, we may not get as much of the market, it may not be there for whatever, but that's not our question. And I think there are stabs at that with things like, B corporations and this and that and the other. But I think to realistically move the weight of what's going on away from the things which are driving the bad effects, you need to ask the question of why do we do it as a whole, as an economic system. But that is not a topic for an HCI talk. So, given that, I guess one last comment here, which is this is not the kind of thing you solve individually. It's the kind of thing you do with teams, with society, with collaboration. So these people made it through the river, or made it down the river, I assume, and they were all working together. They were all consulting. They were all thinking. And I think that's the other part, is to get around the individual genius. I'm going to be the next Steve Jobs and make it safe, whatever it is. But really think, how do we create connection and collections of people that work together to move things in that direction. And with that, I will take questions. Yes.
I saw an interesting article the other day which suggested that if we take a sort of political look at this, we're seeing a lot of arguments from the left around the use of AI, around the sort of foundations of AI, saying, you look at the stochastic argument, right? You look at the ecological points that we brought up in this. You look at the foundations on stolen data, and drawing the conclusion that therefore the ethical thing to do is to not engage with AI, right? And I think you've sort of made a pretty strong case in this talk that that's not the right solution. But do you see that same sort of left-right divide here in American society in particular, around AI use, and what do you see as a conclusion from that?
I mean, again, I have to say this is now my political part, right? But I mean, I think the left-right divide partly is about how much do you care about human values and morals, in the big sense, not the turning point sense. But the left has a lot of people, including me, because I'm definitely on the left, saying, okay, wait a minute, we need to think of what this is doing to human values, what this is doing to the people who don't have the money, and so on. And that's where you get all these critiques and so on. And I think, in general, I don't want to stereotype, but on the right, there is much more of the world should be ruled by the most powerful, and if this gives them more power, that's great, and so on and so on. The underlying philosophy doesn't support that.
Question I'm gonna have is, if you say sort of like AI is accelerant, at least better yet, why is it that professions like HCI or like people who've been studying human and computer interactions were, in my opinion, unable to offer like a valid pushback in a sense, like when these visions are being sort of like promoted by top CEOs of AGI and whatnot, like why was AGI ever taken seriously if there are kind of people who are studying the way to project society?
So let me separate two questions here. Why is AGI taken seriously? And the answer is people always are fascinated by science fiction things and by where things might go and to the extreme. I mean, that's a really interesting thing to talk about. So it's taken seriously, I think, by people who aren't looking at the current things as much as they're sort of projecting. I mean, you look at things like effective altruism and the futurists and so on. They're saying, well, we need to really do the right thing for these trillions of people who are going to exist a million years from now, and so on and so on. That can be fun. It's just not what's going on today. Now, what do people like in HCI and other fields have to offer? And I think it's hard to pin that down because it's not like, well, here's a technology to use instead. It's like, well, let's question how we're using technology in general. And that's, as I've said, a social, cultural question, not a better technology question. Yeah.
So the question about, so you mentioned like nihilism and also like people shifting responsibility, blaming the AI instead of like blaming themselves. I'm just wondering for this problem specifically, like what can we do about it? Like, for example, in designing AI systems.
So let me say, when you say what can we do about it, let me pick out some different we. I do not let AI generate email responses for me. Now, I could, right? It's right there in Gmail. I just click on generate a response and it will. But I feel that what's going to happen is I'm going to stop paying attention. I mean, in general, I can read it and decide if I like it and so on, but it's so easy to say, okay, done. So as an individual level, I think it's important to just keep your focus on what is that you need to pay attention to and to do. Now, can somebody do something as a new technology to prevent that lack of responsibility? I don't think that's a technology question. I mean, that's really how do we, in general, in society, make people aware of the responsibility they have. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about this idea about care. I feel like the way that you described care was kind of on like a global sense, where it's like everyone kind of cares for each other at some fundamental level, and I'm a bit skeptical about that. I feel like you might care for like your family members and maybe locally, and then you might have some kind of individual care, where you care about yourself, and then maybe some people just don't care at all. But do you think that like that granularity of care might affect your care?
So I think care is one of these dangerous words that has a spread of meaning. I started out in linguistics, right? And I always have this sermon, which I won't give you the whole version of, which says anybody who assumes there is a single meaning for a word is being unrealistic, right? It's a feeling, da, da, da. But so care is used for, I mean, you talk about health care or the caring professions. Why am I, as a professor, not in a caring profession? I care about being a professor, right? So I think the version you say, which is I care about my family, right? You give them a primary view of primary allegiance in what you're doing. And the use of care in this context, which is, I admit, sort of philosophically tricky, is a broader sense of not giving a damn. I mean, if you said, do you give a damn about anybody other than your family? And you say, no, I don't. If you say I don't care for them as much, yes. You say I don't give a damn about them, then you're absolved of that responsibility. So I think when I use the word care, it tends to have that latter meaning.
Maybe a last quick question. Oh, okay. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I think this is so important, these questions. I had two questions. One is that cops are getting so emotionally attached to these models, and they're like telling and spilling the beans about all their life. And sometimes these models are, there's been instances where these models are told not to talk about certain political things, or like, deny the existence of, deny the event, like that was Tiananmen Square or things like that. Like, should we worry about people being heavily influenced in the way social media has influenced people? And then second, my question is, are we going to have a shift in society between have and have not? Because people who can pay for the more advanced models get accelerated faster than other parts. Well, increase that K economy.
So let me answer the two parts of that. One is I am worried that people affected by technology, and let's go back to social media, even before AI, you can say, there's no Tiananmen Square, right? And that's something you can use to control people's understanding of things. And I think technical communications media do that, or online, whatever you call it, in a general way. AI can make it less visible and harder to counter. And so I am worried about that. I think how do you create an image of what the world is, and to what extent do you create it through the AIs that you're talking to? The other second part was?
Is there going to be, I could
So we have had have and have-nots in society forever. And we are currently in a stage of increasing division in our country, and I think in the Western world in general. And I think having AI is not the issue, it's having resources which the AI enables. So I don't think it's because I can use a chat and you can't use a chat, that's going to be the big difference. But it's because you can use an AI system which will cause me to lose my job. That's a big difference. So I think AI is not going to solve the problem of have and have-nots by any means.
Well, that's not, my question was, within the people who decide to use AI, some people have access to certain models because they're paying for more advanced, faster, better models that can really improve their output, versus some people will have the cheaper models that won't let them gain that advantage. And I guess I was wondering about.
I think that's true. It's a technological historical fact. I have fast internet, and a lot of people don't have fast internet, and they can't do certain things that I can do because I have fast internet. I have a nice Macintosh laptop, and other people, all they have is a little phone, whatever. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why you get an advantage from having, quote, better technology. I think that's true. I don't see that as one of the key problems.
Okay. With that, let's give Terry a